Welcome. Well, it's finally happened. Solar cycle 25 has now surpassed solar cycle 24, which means there's going to be no grand solar minimum this time around, as I've been saying for some time now. Let's take a look at the details to see what actually is going on. Well, the whole grand solar minimum idea was based on the long-term trend in sunspot number declining over the last 4 cycles. You can see it here, 21 through 24, each being slightly smaller than the previous one. In fact, you could take it back a couple of cycles further to the peak in 1957 and show an even stronger and more consistent decline. The thing about this is there's no basis in science to assume that a trend, once it's started, will continue. Let me give you a couple of examples. You may recall the house price bubble in 2006. For about a decade, house prices have been going steadily up, but in the previous 4 years, the house prices really shot towards the moon. And everybody thought all you had to do was to buy a house, wait a couple of years, and you'd be a millionaire. Well, the trends don't always continue. And in the housing bubble, this is what happened. Housing prices crashed, leaving a lot of people with expensive real estate that they couldn't afford to pay the mortgage on. There's other examples of this, assuming a trend will continue when there's no basis for it. For example, there is the pole shift. Our magnetic pole is moving. It's been doing that forever, but recently it's been moving relatively quickly from northern Canada towards the North Pole. Some people are saying that this trend will continue, and eventually the magnetic configuration of the Earth will flip and the North Pole will become the South and the South will become the North. There is no basis for this whatsoever. So similarly for the sunspot trend, there is no basis that it will continue to go down. And that was the origin of my contention several years ago that this cycle would actually be larger than solar cycle 24. And this last month proved me right. First, let's remind ourselves of some of the predictions. The first and most well-known prediction was that of the NOAA-NASA Solar Cycle Panel, and they predicted that solar cycle 25 would be very similar to solar cycle 24, and that the peak would be in January of 2025, about 11 years later. This is a very safe prediction, and that's the sort of thing that committees generally come up with. Hathaway has been predicting solar cycles for many years now, actually many decades now, and he came up with a prediction of 110, i.e. a slightly smaller cycle, in February of 2025. That's very similar to what the NASA NOAA panel came up with, which is not surprising because he was on it. The person that legitimized all this discussion of a grand solar minimum was Zarkova with her paper in 2015. She used some mathematical methods to predict the next few cycles and came up with the fact that solar cycle 25 would be 90 approximately and peak in March of 2022. Since then, of course, we can measure some of these things, and both of the predictions are incorrect. So the basis for all this fuss about a grand solar minimum, the paper is incorrect. We're already way past 90, so that is incorrect, and we're past March of 2022, and the solar cycle is still going up, so that was incorrect as well. She subsequently revised her prediction in 2021. That prediction had a peak of about 100, so it was higher, and moved it later to September of 2023. The problem I have with that is the mathematical model she based it on, if you compare them between the 2021 paper and the 2015 paper, they are identical. So how can you get different results from the identical model? I don't know. We can also now say that her estimate of 100 is wrong because it's gone way past that number as well. Now, September of 2023 is still a valid possibility, so we can't rule that one out yet, though I am suspicious of it. What did she do to do this? Well, she moved 3 dates. She moved the peak later by 2 years. She moved the solar minimum later by 2 years, to correspond to the minimum that was published by the International Astronomical Union. And she moved the peak of her solar cycle 24 later to 2013. But there's no basis for those movements that I can see. There's another thing that's screwy about this graph. If you look at the scale on the x-axis down here, and measure the distance between these dates on there, which are supposedly each 10 years, they're nonlinear. They're different distances apart, which means she's moved the dates around to make her results look better than they actually are. That is dishonesty. In some of her presentations, Zarkova has stated that Kitsaveli supported her view or confirmed her result. This is the Kitsaveli plot from her paper in 2020. And she has a peak of 45 and a peak of October of 2024. We already know that the 45 is wrong, and that certainly doesn't support the 100 that Zarkova came up with. Still, October 2024 is a possibility, so we can't rule that out. So what is actually happening? Here's the plot from the Solar Influences data center in Belgium, the most recent one, showing the August numbers included. And you can see the sunspot numbers here. The yellow ones are the daily numbers, the blue are the monthly averaged, and the red solid line is the smoothed sunspot number, which is the one that's the most interesting. And then they have two models based on that data so far. The so-called standard curve model, which is the dashed dot model here, predicts that we'll get a solar maximum in early 2024 at about 190. And the other model, which is the combined method, shows that we will have a peak no earlier than middle of 2024 and at 130. Take the average of those, and you've got an average of about 160 as for the peak and sunspot number, but not. We don't really have a good date, but it should be in 2024 sometime. Let's take a look at the smooth sunspot number, which is the thing that's actually used to determine when the peak occurred and what the peak value was. So what I've plotted here is the smooth sunspot number measured for each solar cycle 24 and solar cycle 25 from the respective dates of minima. You can see in blue here is solar cycle 24, and that peaked in April of 2014 at 116. The orange curve is solar cycle 25 so far, and you can see it just peaked above the highest level of solar cycle 24. So solar cycle 25 has overtaken solar cycle 24, albeit marginally at the moment. However, it's continuing to go up and will likely go up for several months yet. I suspect that the lowest value it's going to reach is about 140, but we must wait and see. So what conclusions can we draw from all of this? Solar cycle 25 is now officially larger than solar cycle 24. It's still rising and is likely to rise to at least 140. We're currently in a quiet period. Does that mean that this was the first peak that we've just seen, or was this solar maximum coming early? We won't know for several years yet. We can now assert that all notions of a grand solar minimum are now proven wrong. The debate on that is over. We can't go back and make the sunspot numbers go down to make solar cycle 25 smaller than solar cycle 24, which all of the predictors of the grand solar minimum were claiming. It's likely to go much higher, and so that will further kibosh the idea of a grand solar minimum. So the grand solar minimum people better go away for another 11 years before they come up with more of this rubbish. So we're in for exciting time over the next few years as we climb to maximum and see what the actual peak of this cycle is and when it occurs. So stay tuned for that. So thank you for watching, and until next time, stay safe and goodbye.